If you've watched literally any video on my channel before, you probably have a good understanding of my opinion towards Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi. I don't like it. On the other hand, you know the Avengers? Now, I like the Avengers. I don't know if you could tell that from my previous videos, but yeah. So knowing these two things, I bet you took a look at that thumbnail and said, "Ha! Schaff, you idiot, you mixed up the symbols on the thumbnail. It's supposed to be Last Jedi bad, Endgame good." And to that I say, oh ho ho ho, prepare to get your expectations subverted so hard. Also, spoilers. Endgame is a really good finale and a great send-off for Tony Stark and Steve Rogers. But today, I'd like to talk about the most divisive character in the movie. The person who split audiences on whether or not they treated the character with any dignity or respect. This character, of course, is Cull Obsidian. People weren't too happy when Ant-Man stepped on him and completely disposed of him in such an embarrassing manner. But personally, I think it's a step up from the last movie where Bruce Banner sent him flying into the Gungan force field. So honestly, I'm okay with Cull Obsidian's role in this movie. It's a cool death, so why not? Back in the 90s, I was in a very famous... Huh. That took a lot less time than I expected. I guess while I'm here, I can talk about the second most divisive character in the movie. Thor has had a rough time in these past few films. After losing everyone he loves, getting his chance to avenge them, and completely blowing it, I don't blame him for falling into an alcoholic stupor and drowning his sorrows by playing Fortnite with Korg. That's probably what I would do if I were him, minus the Fortnite. I will play literally any other game with Korg, but a reality where people still play Fortnite in 2023 is scarier than any Thanos. Speaking of Thanos, I think the scene where Thor has a breakdown at the mere mention of Thanos' name is fantastic. It's kind of haunting actually, just how broken he's become and how much he tries to mask his fears. It's some tremendous acting from Hemsworth. I really liked Thor in this movie on my first viewing. He reminded me of Peter B. Parker in a lot of ways, from being chunky due to emotional stress, to meeting an alternate timeline version of his deceased maternal figure, to... what else?
Just those two things.
Just those two things.
But yeah, Thor was tragic and understandable. And aside from the offhand snide comment here and there about his physique, I didn't think they really played him for laughs that often. I thought his story arc was really nice. Then I thought about it and I realized, wait a minute. There's no payoff. Thor never has a heroic moment that redeems his failure in the previous movie. He was regarded by the Russos as the would-be main hero of Infinity War if he had stopped the snap. And he didn't. And killing Thanos after the fact didn't redeem this failure either. Thor is drowning in failure throughout all of Endgame, but there's no sacrifice or dramatic confrontation that pays off any of the self-pity that we see in this movie. He never has a moment that solidifies himself as a true hero, which is weird when you consider that literally every other core Avenger has a moment like that. Hawkeye volunteers to be the one to test the dangerous time travel. Black Widow sacrifices herself for the Soul Stone. Hulk wields the gauntlet and brings everybody back, potentially losing his arm in the process. Cap proves himself worthy enough to wield hammer. And Tony Stark, I don't know. Can you guys think of any sacrifices or heroic moments Tony had? I'm drawing a blank. Thor is the only one who doesn't get one of these moments. And the weird thing is, he did have a moment like this in Infinity War with the whole taking the force of a star thing. But it had a lot less impact since Thor's failures at that point in the story were much less massive. And because it happened while cutting back and forth with an extensive battle, meaning the pacing didn't allow for the same impact where his near sacrifice could really sink in. Giving Thor one of these moments in Endgame, or at the very least a verbal confrontation with Thanos where he affirms that he's not afraid of Thanos despite his failure, would have been all I needed. All he says is, let's kill him properly this time. Yeah, okay, great, but this confrontation with the only guy you ever failed to defeat should have way more weight. It just feels like Thor is fighting him just cause that's what the original 3 Avengers gotta do. Not because of his own personal vendetta against Thanos. That feels largely neglected here. I know Thanos almost sliced Thor open with his own axe at one point, but there was no interplay between those characters, so the fact that it was Thor really didn't make a difference. I mean, the Scarlet Witch confrontation was great. Exactly what I would have hoped for after what happened last movie. Why didn't Thor get a moment like this? Why didn't he get any sort of dramatic beat or sacrifice play during the final battle? He's one of the core Avengers in their final movie together, and he was the main hero in the last movie. It literally started and ended with his confrontations with Thanos. Why does he feel like an afterthought in this movie? On top of that, Thor in Endgame did have his scenes that were played for laughs. He did have his Dark Elves, ooh, scene, and your Lebowski jokes and Cheese Whiz,
and so on and so forth.
He also seems really easy to encourage to join the fight. Like, too easy considering he has the dust of half the universe on his hands. He joins the time travel mission because beer. He talks to his mommy for like 4 minutes and bada boom, he's back to his old self. For how realistically his grief was set up, it's resolved really quickly and without any real weight. I know there's a lot of plot lines and character arcs to fit in, but the movie is 3 hours long. You could have found time to develop one of your main 3 characters more. Just cut the scene where Ant-Man eats a taco. Actually, I take that back. That's one of my favorite scenes. I'm sorry I dissed it. But the more I thought about Thor in this movie and the kind of beats that would make his story arc better, I came to an unfortunate realization. Thor in this movie is just a less developed, worse version of Luke in Last Jedi. Yes, really. 2 legendary heroes broken by failures that left their worlds in ruins. They retreat to some place close to the sea and drink their problems away. Then later, they become heroes yet again. But the main difference, aside from the fact that Luke is mostly treated with dignity, is the fact that Luke's arc throughout the movie is actually focused on and followed through on. A good chunk of the movie, and when I say a good chunk, I mean the only good chunk, is the stuff with him, Rey, and Kylo. While he teaches Rey things about the Force, she helps him come to grips with his own failures. And it really takes a while for him to process and recover from said failures. Thor is fine after one conversation with his mother. Luke, meanwhile, is constantly drowning in his grief. He only agrees to train Rey after careful contemplation and talking to R2 in a really beautiful scene that doesn't feel like cheap fan service at all. It's a touching moment. He second guesses himself over and over about whether or not he should be training Rey. And rejoining the fight? Forget it. He's immovable. The movie makes you feel that. He literally says he came to this island to die, which is heartbreaking. Thor agrees to join the mission because there's booze on the ship. The moment when he rejoins the fight is played off as a joke. Luke rejoins the fight after he's talked some sense into by none other than Yoda. Another great scene, in spite of how bad that puppet is. I'm still not over that.
Oh, it's disgusting.
No, you.
And by the way, Luke rejoining the fight as a hologram instead of in person. First of all, his whole ship is underwater. Second, it's perfectly reasonable considering the grief he's experienced. Whether he's physically there or not, he's still confronting the source of his grief in Kylo. Unlike Thor and Thanos, the entire climax of this movie revolves around the confrontation between the 2 characters who incited this devastation. The villain who tore everything down and the hero who failed to stop them. And technically Endgame doesn't qualify here because this Thanos isn't the same one who killed half the universe. So that's a limitation on Endgame's part and a topic for another day. The Last Jedi, meanwhile, features an emotional confrontation where Luke finally redeems his failure and saves everyone. Failure is the greatest teacher, as Yoda said, and this final showdown ties into the theme of the movie beautifully. It's also beautiful to see Luke speaking hopefully about the future during this confrontation, when he was in such a dark place the whole movie. His death scene is really powerful. It's not pointless, shut up. That's like saying Obi-Wan's death scene is pointless. Watch a movie for its themes and subtleties for once instead of taking everything at face value. Stop complaining that Old Man Cap makes no sense. It's beautiful. Speaking of which, that's the final nail in the coffin for Thor. He has no endgame in this movie. It really feels like they didn't know what to do with him at the end compared to the masterful endings Tony and Steve got. In the grand scheme of things, Thanos was just a minor slip up in the middle of his story, and pretty soon he'll be back to his full comedic self again now that he's joining the Guardians. But Luke? His arc is complete. His story in Last Jedi has a sense of finality to it because the heroic moment during the climax belonged to him. He redeemed his failure in a story that focused on his redemption. Thor was a side character thrown into Endgame to make fat jokes and kinda redeemed later on, but with no real dramatic weight attached to his journey. It feels juvenile, while Luke's story feels mature and poetic. Thor is also not the focus when he could have gotten equal focus to Tony and Steve. I know that's not the case since we'll see more of him, but again, dealing with the repercussions of Thanos was kind of a major thing for his character. But I guess it really wasn't in the grand scheme of things. Now look, I really hate Last Jedi. I'd probably rather rewatch Attack of the Clones since it's at least way funnier and meme filled.
What would he do?
Jump out of a moving vehicle?
If you'll excuse me.
But Last Jedi is not the worst movie ever made, and I have to give credit where I see it. Luke's emotional journey was really compelling. Thor's could have been, but it fell short. Sometimes it's important to let go of our hate and recognize when a bad movie does something better than a good movie. There you go. I brought balance to the Force by talking positively about The Last Jedi for a change. Perfectly balanced. Now that I've said both good and bad things about it, I'm sure the comment section will be perfectly content. You know, at least I tried.
Back in the 90s, I was in a very famous TV show. I'm Mr. Peanut Butter. Now tell me, how can I get your vote? Yeah, I'm for the fireworks.